Before we get started, we want to take a moment to say this. Tonight's episode touches on national security, potential threats inside the United States, and the growing conversation around so-called sleeper cells. This is one of those topics where facts, speculation, fear, and politics all collide, and we want to be clear about something up front. This show is about discussion, not division. We are not here to target any group, religion, or community, and we strongly reject that kind of thinking. What we are here to do is ask questions, challenge narratives, and try to understand what's real, what's being reported, and what it actually means for everyday Americans. Some of what you hear tonight may be uncomfortable, some of it may challenge your perspective, and some of it may raise more questions than answers, but that's the point. So take a breath, listen all the way through, and as always, think for yourself.
What if the next threat to this country doesn't come from across an ocean, but from across the street? What if it's not a missile you see on a radar, but a person you'd never think twice about passing in a grocery store, sitting next to on a flight, or living 3 houses down? Because that's the reality people are starting to quietly talk about again. The idea that the next conflict won't begin with explosions. It'll begin with activation, with people already here, already embedded, already waiting. And whether you believe the reports or not, whether you think it's intelligence finally catching up or narratives being pushed at just the right moment, one thing is undeniable. When words like sleeper cells start entering the conversation again, something shifts. The tone changes, the stakes feel different, and people start asking questions they haven't asked in a long time. Are we prepared? Are we paying attention? And maybe the most uncomfortable one of all, have we already let something in that we can't see? Because tonight isn't just about what's real or what's rumor. It's about how close the line is between the two and what happens if we're wrong. All right, let's bring in the crew tonight, because this is one of those conversations where perspective matters, and I've got the full panel ready to go. Brian is here, and you already know he's coming in hot tonight. This is right in his wheelhouse: national security, borders, and what he's been saying for a long time about threats we're not taking seriously enough. Rachel is with us, bringing that independent lens, cutting through the noise, asking the questions a lot of people are thinking but not saying out loud, especially when it comes to what's fact versus what's being amplified. Daniel's in the building, and if there's a deeper layer to this, if there are threads connecting things that don't seem obvious on the surface, he's going to start pulling on them, because this kind of story doesn't just exist in a vacuum. And Skylar is here as well, bringing that perspective that challenges all of it. Civil liberties, unintended consequences, and what happens when fear starts driving decisions instead of facts. And me, I'm just trying to make sense of where the line is between being aware and being played, so let's get into it. So over the last few days, we've started hearing more and more about potential Iranian sleeper cells possibly operating inside the United States. And depending on where you're getting your information from, this is either being treated like a quiet, serious national security concern, or something that's being amplified without clear, verifiable details. And that's where this gets complicated. Because on one hand, history tells us that threats don't always announce themselves. They build quietly, under the radar, until it's too late. But on the other hand, we've also seen how quickly fear-based narratives can spread, especially when tensions overseas start rising and people are already on edge. So the question tonight isn't just whether sleeper cells exist. It's bigger than that. It's whether we're actually uncovering something real that's been building for years, or if we're being conditioned to expect something that may or may not be there. And if they are here, how did it happen? How long have they been here? And why are we just now hearing about it? So Brian, I'm coming to you first. Are we dealing with a real threat that's been ignored? Or is this being pushed harder than the facts support?
Artie, I'm going to say this as clear as I can. This isn't new, this isn't surprising, and this sure as hell isn't some coincidence that just popped up overnight. This is exactly what a lot of us have been warning about for years now, and people kept getting called crazy or extreme for even bringing it up. You don't need to be some intelligence expert to understand how this works. When you have wide open borders, when you lose track of who's coming into your country, when you stop prioritizing national security in the name of politics or optics, you create the perfect environment for bad actors to slip in quietly and stay there. And here's the part people don't want to say out loud. If sleeper cells exist, they're not going to look like some Hollywood version of a threat. They're going to blend in, they're going to live normal lives, and they're going to wait. That's the whole point. So when reports start surfacing about this, I don't look at it like some exaggerated narrative. I look at it like confirmation that we've been asleep at the wheel, and now people are starting to wake up. But the question is, are we too late? Because once that kind of infrastructure is in place, once people are already embedded, you're not talking about prevention anymore. You're talking about response. And that's a much more dangerous place to be.
Yeah, and that's exactly where this conversation starts to split because what you're saying, Brian, is going to resonate with a lot of people who feel like we've ignored warning signs for too long, that we've been reactive instead of proactive, and that when something like this starts getting talked about, it's not the beginning of the problem, it's the moment we finally notice it. But at the same time, this is also where things can get murky really fast because words like sleeper cells carry weight. They change how people think, how they see their neighbors, how they interpret what's happening around them. And if we don't have clear, verified information, it becomes really easy for fear to fill in the gaps. And we've seen that before in this country. So the question becomes not just what's possible, but what's actually proven, what's confirmed, and what's being assumed, because those are three very different things. So, Rachel, I want to bring you in here. When you hear this kind of reporting and this kind of conversation starting to build, what's your first reaction? Are we uncovering something real, or are we stepping into dangerous territory where speculation starts driving the narrative?
My first reaction is to slow everything down because this is exactly the kind of topic where the speed of the conversation can outpace the actual facts. And when that happens, people start filling in blanks with assumptions instead of evidence. And that's where things can go off the rails really quickly. Look, I'm not dismissing the possibility that there could be legitimate national security concerns because history has shown us that threats can and do exist beneath the surface. But what I am saying is that words like sleeper cells should come with a very high burden of proof, not just headlines or unnamed sources or vague warnings that leave too much open to interpretation. Because once that language enters the public space, it doesn't just stay contained to policy discussions, it trickles down into everyday life, into how people view entire communities, and into how quickly fear can override reason. And we've seen that pattern before, especially in the years after 9/11, where the line between caution and overreaction got blurred in ways that had real consequences for people who had nothing to do with any threat. So for me, the question isn't just, could this be real? It's, what do we actually know? What's been confirmed? And what are we being asked to believe without clear evidence? Because if we don't separate those things, we risk making decisions based on emotion instead of reality. And that's when things tend to go wrong.
And that right there is the tension in this whole conversation. Because on one side, you've got the argument that we've been too slow, too relaxed, maybe even too distracted to notice what could be building right in front of us. And on the other side, you've got the reminder that if we move too fast without solid information, we can create a whole different kind of problem, one driven by fear instead of facts. And the truth is, both of those things have happened before, which is what makes this so complicated, because it's not just about whether something is real or not. It's about timing. It's about why we're hearing about it now. And it's about who controls the narrative when something like this starts gaining traction. And that's where this takes a different turn, because some people look at this and see a delayed warning, and others look at it and start asking why now, why this framing, and what's happening behind the scenes that we're not seeing. So, Daniel, I want to bring you in here because this is where you tend to connect dots that aren't always obvious on the surface. When you hear this conversation starting to build, what do you see? Is this something that's been quietly developing for years? Or is there something bigger going on behind the timing of all this?
I don't think this is something that just suddenly appeared, and I don't think the timing is random either, because if you look at how these kinds of narratives emerge, they almost never start at the moment the problem begins. They surface when the problem is either already established or when it becomes useful to talk about it. And that's the part people don't like to sit with, because it raises two uncomfortable possibilities at the same time. One, that there has been a long-term failure to detect or act on something that's been quietly developing for years, maybe even decades. And two, that information is being released or emphasized now for a reason that has less to do with discovery and more to do with positioning, whether that's geopolitical tension, policy justification, or shaping public perception. And I'm not saying one cancels out the other. In fact, they can both be true at the same time, because historically, intelligence gaps don't happen in isolation, and neither does narrative control. They tend to overlap. So when I hear sleeper cells, I don't immediately jump to panic, but I also don't dismiss it as noise. I start asking questions about timelines, about what was known and when, about what wasn't acted on, and about why the conversation is being amplified now instead of earlier. Because if something has been building under the surface, then this isn't the beginning of the story. This is just the point where we're finally being allowed to see part of it. And usually, when that happens, there's a reason.
Yeah. And that's where this conversation starts to feel bigger than just one headline, because now you're not just talking about whether something exists or doesn't. You're talking about timing, awareness, and how information actually reaches the public. And when you start layering that on top of what Brian's saying about being late to recognize a threat, and what Rachel's saying about the danger of moving too fast without clear evidence, you end up right in the middle of a very uncomfortable space. Because either we've missed something serious for a long time, or we're being pulled into a narrative at a moment where people are already on edge. And maybe it's a mix of both. But either way, the impact doesn't stay in the realm of policy or intelligence briefings. It trickles down into everyday life, into how people see each other, how trust shifts, and how quickly fear can change behavior. And that's where this conversation takes a human turn, because history has shown us that when fear enters the equation, it doesn't just stay focused on the threat, it spreads, sometimes in ways that hit people who had nothing to do with it. So, Skylar, I want to bring you in here because this is where your perspective matters. When conversations like this start gaining traction, what concerns you the most? The possibility of a threat being real, or the consequences of how people respond to it?
What concerns me most is how quickly fear can move faster than facts, because once that happens, the focus doesn't stay on identifying a real, specific threat. It starts expanding outward in ways that affect people who have nothing to do with it. And we've seen that pattern before, where language like this, sleeper cells, internal threats, enemy within, it doesn't stay contained to intelligence briefings or policy circles. It filters down into everyday interactions, into assumptions, into suspicion, and into how entire communities get perceived almost overnight. And that's where real harm can happen, even if the original concern is valid, because the reaction can become broader than the reality. And I think we have to be very careful not to repeat mistakes where fear justifies overreach, whether that's increased surveillance, erosion of civil liberties, or policies that target more people than they protect against, because once those lines get crossed, they're very hard to walk back. So for me, this isn't about ignoring potential risks. It's about making sure that how we respond is grounded in verified information, not escalation driven by uncertainty. Because if we don't get that balance right, we can end up creating damage internally while trying to prevent something externally. And that's a cost that doesn't always get talked about until it's already happened.
And that's really where this all lands tonight, right in that uncomfortable middle where no answer feels completely settled. Because on one side, you've got the possibility that something serious has been building quietly, something we either missed or chose not to see. And on the other side, you've got the reality that how we react to that possibility can shape the country just as much as the threat itself. And maybe the truth is, it's not one or the other. Maybe it's both. Maybe there are real concerns that deserve attention, and at the same time, a conversation that can take on a life of its own if we're not careful. Because words matter, timing matters, and how quickly people move from awareness to fear matters. And I think what stands out to me the most is this: whether this is a confirmed threat or an emerging narrative, the fact that we're even having this conversation again says something about where we are right now as a country. Trust is low, tensions are high, and people are trying to figure out what's real in a world where information moves faster than understanding. So maybe the real question isn't just, are we compromised? Maybe it's, how do we stay aware without losing perspective? Because if we get that wrong, we don't just risk missing a threat, we risk becoming something we don't recognize in the process.
All right, before we get into final thoughts, just a quick pause to remind you, if you've been riding with us, if you've been part of these conversations, part of this community, There are a lot of ways to support what we're building here with Data and Dissonance, and one of the easiest is through the merch. Everything from the coffee blends to the hoodies, hats, mugs, and even the bumper stickers that say exactly what a lot of people are already thinking, but maybe not saying out loud. And what's cool is it's not just about wearing something or drinking something with the logo on it. It's about being part of something bigger, a community that values conversation, perspective, and thinking for yourself. So if you haven't checked it out yet, take a minute, browse through it, find something that fits your style, and just know that every bit of support helps keep this show growing, evolving, and reaching more people every single day.
You know, what stands out to me after this conversation isn't just the question of whether something like this is real or not. It's how quickly we're forced to operate in that gray area where we don't have clear answers, but we're still expected to react like we do. Because that space right there between awareness and fear, between possibility and proof, that's where people start to lose their footing. And when that happens, it becomes really easy to either ignore something serious or overreact to something that isn't fully understood yet. And I think that's where we are right now as a country. We're trying to process information that's coming at us fast, layered with emotion, layered with tension from everything happening globally, and layered with a growing distrust in where that information is coming from in the first place. So when you hear something like sleeper cells, it doesn't just land as a headline, it hits people differently. It creates questions, it creates concern, and for some, it creates fear. And the challenge is figuring out what to do with that without letting it take over how we think. Because the truth is, both things can exist at the same time. There can be real risks that deserve attention, and there can also be narratives that grow faster than the facts behind them. And if we're not careful, we can end up reacting to the loudest version of the story instead of the most accurate one. And that's where perspective matters. Not just what you hear, but how you process it, how you question it, and whether you're willing to sit in that uncertainty long enough to actually understand it before forming a conclusion. So wherever you land on this tonight, whether you think this is something serious that's been building quietly or something that's being amplified in the moment, the responsibility still falls on you to stay aware without losing perspective, to stay informed without becoming reactive, and to remember that just because something feels urgent doesn't always mean it's fully understood yet. Because in a world where information moves fast and truth takes time, the difference between reacting and understanding matters more than ever. And as always, remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Tonight's episode is brought to you by the world behind Data and Dissonance. Starting with the Caleb Rourke thriller series, The Covenant Protocol, The Prophet Directive, and Black Echo Rising. A high-stakes saga that dives into covert operations, global power struggles, and the kind of hidden truths that feel a little too close to reality. If you like stories that blur the line between fiction and what could actually be happening behind the scenes, this series is for you. Available now on Amazon. And that world doesn't stop with books. It carries over into the music that fuels this entire brand. From the raw, grunge-inspired album Uncaged, built on real-life struggles, past battles, and the weight of experiences that don't just fade away, to Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, a country-driven album rooted in faith, freedom, family, and the backbone of everyday American life. These aren't just songs, they're stories, they're perspective, and they're part of the same voice you hear right here on this show. So whether you're diving into the books or turning up the music, you're stepping into the full Data and Dissonance universe.